And joining us live in studio is Kate Skinner, SOS member and also broadcast researcher. We have Professor Sipho Siepe in studio and Sfiso Mahlangu, our political analyst. Joining us on the line or via Skype is Jeshri Pather, interim organizer for Media Freedom, Diversity and Subcommittee for Right to Know. And Vincent Smith is the chairperson of the ad hoc committee on the SABC board inquiry. And you at home are most welcome to give us a call. Just what you make of the leaked document of the SABC report so far. To our studio guests, thanks so much for joining us. Kate, I think we'll give you the honor of ladies first in your reaction just with the leaked document and how it's essentially been taken as concrete evidence and also affording guilt by or at least the court of public opinion.
I think what's important to say that obviously this is just it's got no formal status at all, because it's a draft report. It was basically leaked and it was a starting point for the ad hoc committee to then have a discussion. So it doesn't have any particular status. But having said that, I do think that a number of the comments, a number of the kind of recommendations that were made seem to be quite powerful and seem to be just the kind of things that did need to be made. It covers quite a lot of different issues. It covers the finances. It covers issues around the Public Broadcasting Act and the Companies Act. Issues around the minister and the role that the minister should be playing. An interesting thing about a forensic audit that needs to happen in terms of multi-choice and the so-called handing over of the SABC archives. So I felt that there were some important issues that were covered, and it was quite comprehensive, even though it was just a starting point.
Yeah, but I mean, in the 2 months, of course, we were glued to the TV screens. As you're saying, a lot of damning evidence, or rather submissions, were made by various witnesses. It just seems to be more of a fact-finding, or as our reporter was saying, like a fishing expedition, because now it recommends a further probe. What was the whole purpose, in your view, of this ad hoc committee meeting on the SABC?
Well, I think even before, I do not want to quibble with the recommendations. It's very important that the process must also be credible. And one must also start by saying the decision seems to have enjoyed of establishing this committee seems to have enjoyed the support of all political parties. There was a decision taken by the NEC of the ANC on this matter, and that this matter needed to be dealt expeditiously. And we know that the DA had been on the case of Saudi Mutwaneng. And we also know that some members of the ANC had been on the case. So, and the other political parties have not been that active, but they've also held the same view. So from the onset, you already had a grouping that had one mind. And so I could even argue that you could easily have written the outcome given the conversion of thought on the matter. So that is the first thing that one must raise. And then from there, you would expect that we should raise the bar around the credibility of witnesses themselves. Because especially as the chair had also said, that those who may have lied may have to face the wrath of the law or the wrath of the parliament. But what was significant for me is the posture of the committee. I find that there was also, not to say the other people were not, there was less questioning on what appeared to be the throwing of dirt. So when Ngubane came into the picture, he actually says it is important for the committee to take all the submissions that seems to be corroborated by people. And of course, when you are watching any process like this, and you are going to be next, and you see the inclination of the committee towards a particular view, it is most likely that you are going to be emboldened to say what others have actually said. So the corroboration happens when the process is as it was. This is why in a court of law, witnesses are not expected to hear what other witnesses say, so that they speak authentically, not that they simply become mimicking. So I found that the posture was very different when Ngubane came, because Ngubane was suggesting a different narrative, sophisticating, and I think he was correct to suggest that the committee must first go and verify this with minutes, with tapes. But most importantly, the committee also must ask itself, where was Parliament all this time? Because there is a tendency to find fault elsewhere and not to be inward-looking. And one of the presenters there was Professor Kumalo. He said, this committee, this Parliament, must also assume the blame. Because for a number of occasions, the Portfolio Committee was receiving reports from the SABC. So why now? Why all this time they have not raised these issues? So those are some of the issues that need to be problematized.
All right,
even
we
as
have the
look at
chairperson
report.
of the ad hoc committee on the SABC issue, Mr. Vincent Smith. Thanks so much for joining us. Of course, it has been a very grilling session since November, looking into the operations at the SABC. Are we likely to see in the final report the ad hoc committee also taking liability in the rot that has been so perennial in the SABC?
Good evening.
Good evening.
First of all, I think let's start by saying that, as Kate said, this report is a working document. And we were very deliberate when we said that we will present a working document. Parties or members will go and apply their mind, and we will start the process of drafting a report from tomorrow. So it has no status whatsoever. And everything that's in that report is open for discussion and debate. So I thought, let's start there. And secondly, dispel this notion that it was leaked, because, of course, when you take it to your principal, it becomes public. So I wanted to dispel that first. But let me get to, will the ad hoc committee take responsibility? If you read the working papers, it's very clear that one of the observations is that the Portfolio Committee, and by extension Parliament, could have done much more urgently. So there is no absolving of Parliament from its role or lack thereof of playing an oversight. So that must be cleared out. The second point that I would like to make is, and that probably responds to Professor Siepe's where was Parliament. It's clear in our report. We've said that it was not there as it should have been there. So I don't think that's a matter that needs to be debated. It's in our working document. The second one of one mind and or almost a predetermined solution, I have to disagree with that, because what we have put there was what witnesses have said. And there were witnesses that were board members, or ex-board members. We afforded the opportunity to the current board, including the executive. They chose to walk out in the first instance, which was unparalleled in South Africa. Total disregard for Parliament and the Portfolio Committee. Secondly, when we wrote them that letter, we had indicated to them that after your evidence, you have the right to call people who you would think would corroborate your story. It's there, up front. So this of one mind, I can't agree with Professor Siepe. If the board chose not to exercise it, it can't be a blame of the ad hoc committee.
Yeah, but Mr. Smith, just a quick one. I mean, all the witnesses were speaking essentially about the empirical evidence, in the sense that it's their experience at the SABC. Being a former employee myself, I can tell you that there are differing experiences, or if you like, the fact that you would be disgruntled based on maybe what your line manager had done and not necessarily as a culture of the organization. Don't you think that perhaps a different voice for those that say the transformation element in the SABC is a feather in the cap of be it the board or the executive, you know, that there's more job security when it comes to freelancers, etc. All we essentially heard was only the one side of the coin.
Let me correct that, Cindy. We didn't hear one side of the coin. And by the way, I agree with you that people will have their own agendas. But let me indicate that the public the public protector herself said that her recommendations were not implemented. That's not staff. ICASA said that the board failed to implement what was agreed upon, and to the extent that they are now in a court process. So that's not staff members. The Auditor General, which is a Chapter 9 institution, categorically says that there is irregular expenditure made in vain that could have been avoided to the tune of 92 million. irregular expenditure to the tune of 5.1 billion. And that irregular expenditure, by the way, is made up of no tax clearances, payments made without contracts, supply chain management. So just on those state institutions' evidence alone, it's very clear that the accounting authority did not perform its functions.
Mr. Smith, Professor Siepe just wants to interject there.
Yeah, Vincent, I do not want to really get into dialogue with you, but what Cindy was also saying, I mean, I accept the bona fides of all the people who were there. What I'm raising is the rigor of the process. And what she's also saying is that what I also saw there were people who were disgruntled. And as she said, she has also been working there. There are people who hold a different view and who have a different experience. So for the report to be comprehensive, it might help. For instance, I always find the first groupings to always complain are the unions. I'm surprised that you don't have the union also being called, because there is a communication workers union that should have been there. There are people who are ordinary workers who should have been there, at least to express themselves, not only because it becomes almost like an elite project. But there's something that cannot be denied. The point is, there was a political decision taken by the ANC to deal with this matter expeditiously. And the tone of that was very clear. The DA had always taken a position. So you can't tell me that when people went in there, there was a sense of open-mindedness. So that this was so obvious for those of us when I saw those who presented a particular narrative to be almost being encouraged. And when I saw Ngubane, the manner in which there was a certain level of hostility to what he was saying, I never had the benefit of seeing the other chairperson. But all I'm saying, you need to factor that as you write the final report, but also take what he had said to say, let this not be simply statement. Let them be verifiable in terms of evidence, in terms of the tapes, in terms of the minutes and all that. So that's all I'm simply saying. Add rigor to the process. Otherwise, it may not stand the muster. But these are the preliminary comments on what we saw.
All right, your response was, Vincent?
I agree with the professor that there must be rigor. Let me start by saying that ours was to answer the question whether the board was fit, not to solve the problems of the SABC. And I agree that in an ongoing manner to fix up the malaise in the SABC, there might be a need to talk to a much broader constituency, and I have no problem with that. Ours was to answer the question, has the board performed as per its mandate? And in doing so, ours was not an accusatorial. Nobody was going to be found innocent or guilty. Ours was an inquisitorial to gather evidence. And that evidence that we gathered should inform the response that we give to Parliament. From the evidence that we've gathered, one, we need to verify if it's credible, because nobody can deny the fact that there was serious contradictions.
All right, sorry, Vincent. We pressed on time. Let's just get Yashri Patha, who's been very patient, from Rights to Know, an interim organizer with Media Freedom Diversity Subcommittee for Right to Know. Thanks so much, Yashri, for your time. Again, it's the whole the process in itself that we analyzing, if you will, to determine, in a sense, what the outcome will be, especially when it came to serious allegations around the multi-choice and the archives deal, where Mr. Hlaudi Motsoeneng is allegedly to have benefited from there. When it comes to those kind of serious allegations without any concrete evidence, albeit that the nature of the ad hoc committee was not necessarily to afford guilt or innocence to anybody, what do you think this does in the viewer's point of view, and especially in the lack of confidence that already exists in the SABC? Yashri? I think we've lost Yashri, so maybe you can answer that one.
Well, the matter is clear that this was not the sitting of the ad hoc committee. It was not the profound judgment of the ad hoc committee gathering all the evidence. This was an attempt to find a political martyr versus a political villain, and that villain has been found. If a matter like this comes into play, particularly in the House of Parliament, to deal with Mr. Hlaudi Motsoeneng, then that whip has been brought and that shambok has hit him. If we're going to help the SABC and particularly investigate, then we must be clear to which administration we start. Because Mr. Dalimbofu came in, he got a golden handshake. I don't know why Mr. Motsoeneng would be different within his departure. We don't consider the history of the SABC because we are here to deal with Mr. Motsoeneng, and that's what this sitting was supposed to do. This sitting was not supposed to deal with a particular individual, but it was supposed to assess the withstanding and the ability to hold office of this particular board. It is a failed board. The last board member was Professor Maguve, who was questioned and then he left.
You think their approach or the terms of reference were derailed by focusing largely on...
Let me give you a classic example. If you're going to investigate a matter, you've got to put it on the periphery to say, how has the SABC been performing? Look at the audits. But to have Ms. Van Dam question whether Mr. Cloudy bought the Minister of Communications a house and to repeat that question is driving a point. And we have no proof of that. But there is a villain to be got here. There's something to be found.
Let's get Kate to respond. Sorry, Sfiso.
So, I mean, I think it's very interesting what you're saying about that, but my view is actually quite different, because if I look at all of those different findings, they are actually quite comprehensive. I mean, they look at the issues of the finances, and those are very clear. I mean, the issue around the amount of fruitless and wasteful expenditure and the amount of irregular expenditure, I mean, those come out with, from the Auditor General. I mean, also the issues around, specifically on the multi-choice deal. I think what was interesting was this idea that they're not going to make any pronouncements, the portfolio committee. They're saying that we need a forensic audit. And I think that forensic audit is an excellent suggestion, because that will get to the bottom of what exactly happened in terms of
not to encourage a dialogue between
archive.
the two of you. Please finish your thought process, and then we'll go to Professor Siepo and give Mr. Smith
it's going to be very difficult to help an SOE if we're driving political agendas. And if our political agenda is to deal with someone who Mr. Motsoeneng's qualifications are not disputed right now because he was very clear on them. His deliverables thereof are a very different case. Mr. Motsoeneng bought the 90% of local content, which ticked off a lot of industry players. It really set, the white monopoly capital furor alight. And this is the rendition that this has brought him into. Local content is going to change the music industry, the arts industry as a whole in this country. There's 14 SABC radio stations. If they all play local content, all the money is going to be staying here at home and feeding our artists. But it was going to break a particular economic frame that white monopoly has been running for over 30 years in this country. And so this man would become a villain to an economic supply that people have been living like for years.
All right, Vincent, just on the issue of the terms of reference and whether it was more fixation on Saudi and the current board that you missed the opportunity to also investigate, or rather probe the effectiveness of previous boards that have left the SABC where it is today.
Well, let's start by saying that, and you can go through the working papers. Nowhere in the working papers has there been any call of guilt or otherwise made on any individual, including Saudi. So I don't understand this fixation that this was about Saudi. This says the board failed to do A, B, C, D, E, and F. None of our recommendations, or at least the working paper, and it will still be changed when we discuss it, has made any finding on any individual. But there can be no dispute that the report of the public protector says the appointment was done irregularly. That is an indictment on the accounting authority, which is the board. The report says that in terms of the multi-choice deal, there were differences of opinion within the board. It's an indictment on the board. So nowhere is there an attack on an individual. It has never been about an individual. It has been about, is that board that is tasked with ensuring that South Africans are educated, are entertained, and get free and fair information did their job. And that is what it was about. Not about individuals, it was about the board and the performance of the board.
Okay, Professor Siepe, I think you also raised the issue around what we base at this particular, or rather the genesis of this ad hoc committee, the fact that there had been other institutions that had found operational maladministration in the SABC. But what we saw with the ad hoc committee, it was essentially more insinuations and hearsay or anecdotal evidence that people gave based on their experience, including the multi-choice deal, where there was no a paper trail to say this is the agreement that was signed on this particular date, and this is something that is of concern to you. It was just about people deposing what they felt or heard had been happening. Mr. Smith.
No, you're right in that. But remember, we had asked the SABC to provide Parliament with all the minutes of the board meetings. They failed to do that. So it's not about individuals, because we wanted to ascertain whether the decisions of the board, one, were regular, and two, if they were regular, were those decisions implemented. We haven't received all those documents to the extent that we had to go for a summons. So, and that is why we are saying in our report that we can't be definitive on these matters, but we can say that the incoming board must follow up on these matters, including monies that the Auditor General says were used wrongly. And it is the forensic audit and those follow-ups that will ascertain once and for all what went wrong, because we cannot in 2 months fix up, as one of your colleagues said, the malaise of a institution that has been ongoing from even before apartheid. Recall, this is the final thing I want to say, it is this democratic parliament or democratic dispensation that said we must move away from a state broadcaster as it was pre-94 to a public broadcaster, where the interests of the public are paramount and not the interest of a particular government or a particular political party.
All right, as you mentioned, or at least the document that is now in public circulation, that you are asking for a forensic probe. Is this all that the ad hoc committee is going to look at? What are the other recommendations?
Well, there is a recommendation, for instance, that says that the role of Parliament has to be improved, because a portfolio committee can't allow a situation where any state institution gets to where it is without them having pronounced on it. We also are saying, for instance, one of the more, let's call it sexy parts, that in her presentation, Ms. Shabalala said there was political interference. We are saying that political interference must be condemned in the first instance. Secondly, if there is political interference, it must be brought to the public. And thirdly, Parliament must act on it. So those are the recommendations. We're also saying that there must be clarity between which legislation governs the SABC. You can't use the Public Broadcasting Act in 1 minute, and the next minute you use the Companies Act to remove board members. When you want to remove them, you use the Companies Act. And board members remove each other. When we appoint, we use Parliament. So I'm saying those grey areas need to be fixed up, and that is very clear in our recommendations, just to mention but a few.